everyone, welcome to our lecture on fungal diseases. So far we have covered bacteria and viruses fairly extensively. The good news is fungi, protozoa, and helminths are a little bit easier, at least in terms of the number of organisms we cover. We cover a lot fewer in these next couple of lectures because these are ones that aren't, at least at this point in time, quite as common for people to encounter. Most of the infections in our lives and the ones that you will see as healthcare providers, or at least healthcare adjacent providers, are ones with bacteria and viruses. There will probably be some with fungi, protozoa, and helminths, but most of them are going to be bacteria and viruses. And that's why we cover those in such depth. However, with fungi, protozoa, and helminths, we're just going to hit kind of the highlights and really just talk about some of the most common ones that we would potentially see in the US or in some cases worldwide. The first fungus that we'll talk about is called Coccidioides immitis, and it causes a disease most commonly referred to as valley fever. Now this one's actually very significant for us in the Southwest because this is where most of the cases in the United States are. We find it primarily in California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico to a certain extent. But for the most part, when we talk about this particular fungal infection, it's happening in the southwestern United States. In terms of its lifestyle and where we find it, we tend to find the fungus itself in the soil. Mostly it's associated with the soils of warm or hot climates. So like I was saying, southwestern part of the US. And as this organism grows, it releases spores. And these spores are spread throughout the air, typically when the wind blows. And as you know, in Vegas, we get a lot of wind. So as the wind is blowing and spreading those spores around, people are breathing them in, they get into people's lungs, and they cause this disease that we call valley fever. Most of the time, this disease is fairly mild. A lot of people might not really notice that they have had it. If they do notice something, it's typically a fairly mild illness. They might have a low-grade fever, maybe some body aches, maybe a slight cough, but they get over it within a week or two and just go on with their lives. So for most people, it causes what's called a self-limiting pulmonary infection, meaning it stays local to the lungs, doesn't spread throughout the body, and doesn't really cause a lot of problems. For some people though, and sometimes dogs as well, this fungus will start to spread throughout the body and cause a systemic infection. The fungus is very good at infecting various regions of the body, and one region it's very good at infecting is the bones, actually. The bones, either in the legs or in the spine, are particularly susceptible to this fungus, and it is one that can cause long-term damage and lots of problems to the body if it moves out of the lungs and isn't caught soon enough. Our next fungus is probably one of the most common causes of fungal infections throughout the world, not just the US. And this fungus has several different species within the genus we call Tinea. Now, many times the infection that this organism causes is called a ringworm. So lots of people mistakenly think that the disease called ringworm is caused by a helminth or a worm, but in reality, it's caused by a fungus. In terms of the life cycle distribution of this particular organism, it is found on and around humans, it is found on and around animals, and it's also found in the soil. So there's a lot of different areas that we can potentially come in contact with this organism, and some of us probably even carry it in low numbers without it causing a problem for various periods throughout our lifetime. Now, the deal with this one is most of the time when it's out in the environment, it exists in what we call the spore form. Remember, spores of fungi are different than spores of bacteria. We didn't go into that a lot in this class, although you probably talked about it in lab at least a little bit. Bacterial spores are protective structures, whereas fungal spores are primarily reproductive structures. So this fungus makes spores, releases them into the environment, and those spores kind of hang out and wait until environmental conditions are good. Once it finds a suitable host, it will start to grow on that host. And most of the time, it has a fairly long incubation period. So those spores will hang out maybe on our skin somewhere, and it might take a week, 2 weeks or so for it even to grow sufficiently for us to start to notice it. Once it does start to grow, at least enough for us to notice it, we will get some type of infection around our skin somewhere, on our arm, on our feet, near our neck, the base of our neck. Sometimes men will get it in their beard. Sometimes we get it in our nails. Basically, this is one that can infect all kinds of places on the body. And in addition to the general infection that it causes, it often provokes a decent amount of inflammation, and many people are actually allergic to this fungus. So in addition to the infection, they have an allergic reaction with additional inflammation and swelling, which causes additional problems. Now, like I said, this fungus really can infect all kinds of places on the body. For the most part, this is going to cause a superficial infection, meaning it's just going to stay in the outer layers of skin. Most of the time, except potentially in very rare circumstances, we will not see this fungus dig deep into the body. It's most common in places like the scalp, like I said, on men in kind of the beard area, on the foot, where we tend to refer to it as athlete's foot, in the nail, or just kind of anywhere on the body where sometimes it forms this circular type structure that we refer to as ringworm. In terms of treatment, most of the time, this one is fairly easy to treat. Again, one of the reasons for that is because it does stay superficial. It doesn't usually get very deep in the body. There are different topical medications that can be used, most of which you can even just buy at drugstores these days or at the pharmacy in an over-the-counter situation. You may not even need a prescription for it. Although, if those are not working, one of the newer treatments for it, and newer, by newer I say in the last 10 years or so, one of these newer treatments for it is repeated UV light exposures. And this isn't necessarily something to try at home. This should be done under the supervision of a healthcare provider just to make sure you're not overexposing that area. So it is something that it's not something you're going to do on your own, but you go into a clinic or a hospital or wherever healthcare facility, and they can expose certain parts of the body to UV light in a controlled situation that will help damage this fungus without hopefully causing too much damage to the skin and other tissue around it. Our next type of fungus is another one that is probably one of the most common causes of fungal infections in the world. And this fungus is a member of the genus Candida. And Candida albicans is typically normal flora for humanity, meaning that most of us carry this with us, at least in low numbers, on our skin in most places in our body. So most of the time, this fungus is living on our skin, not really causing a problem, but under certain circumstances, when it starts to overgrow, it does start to kind of stretch out into what we call pseudohyphae and then start releasing digestive enzymes that start to break down our skin. So most of the time, Candida is in this lovely little oval shape. It happens to be a yeast, but when it starts to become kind of more pathogenic, when conditions in our body change a little bit, and it starts to be able to grow more intensely or grow in greater numbers, then it starts to elongate. And instead of being just one of these nice little ovals that we can kind of find hanging out, it starts to stretch out. And it starts to connect with other fungal cells nearby. So each one of these is their own cell, and they form what are called these pseudohyphae that are able to stretch very deep into the body. In addition to getting longer and kind of stretching out and being able to reach into deeper tissues in the body, it starts to release various digestive enzymes that start to break down our cells, as well as the structures that are kind of holding our cells together. So it really just starts to degrade tissue as it goes, and it allows it to just reach further and further into the body. In terms of infections or where it can infect in the body, it can really infect all kinds of places. Some of the most common are places like the mouth, especially for babies. When you hear about babies getting a thrush infection, that's what they have. They have a Candida infection in their mouth. This could also go and extend to the GI tract, either the esophagus, the small intestine, or the large intestine. Not as much the stomach because of the acid content there, but it can extend into pretty much all of the GI tract except for the stomach. It can also be a significant cause of vaginal yeast infections. It can infect the lungs. It can infect various internal organs. It can get into the blood and start to spread that way. And if it gets out of control and gets into the blood and other internal organs, it becomes very difficult to treat, unfortunately, and the prognosis is often not very good. So ideally, when we get one of these infections, we try to treat it quickly and treat it effectively so it doesn't start to spread into the body. Now, there is another species of Candida I did just want to bring up. This one is relatively new. It may not be a new species per se, but it's new in terms of its ability to cause problems for humanity because it has a lot of resistance to our existing antifungal medications. So Candida auris is one that you might start to hear about periodically over the next 5 to 10, maybe even 15 years or so. It is what we call kind of an emerging pathogen, meaning that we don't have a lot of cases right now, but we are seeing a rise in the number of cases and have seen a rise in the number of cases over the last couple of years. And like I said, the very unfortunate thing about this one is that it happens to be resistant to a lot of our existing antifungal medications, meaning that when someone gets this infection, it's very difficult to get rid of because most of our medications don't work on it. So this is definitely one to be aware of, keep your eye on, make sure that if you're working with a patient who has this infection, you take all proper precautions for yourself, for that patient, and for other people that might be around you. And just really stay on top of this one, read what you can about it, and know what you can about it in the next several years. And then finally, our last fungus that we'll talk about is one called Pneumocystis. I told you guys this was a short lecture. I really tend to hit bacteria and viruses very hard and then ease up a little bit with these remaining pathogens. So Pneumocystis jivarechii is actually one that had its name changed recently. Occasionally you might still find the old name. Most of it's been updated, but it used to be Pneumocystis carni. But its name was changed relatively recently. I don't mean like last week. I just mean within the last decade or so. So this is one that actually is a fairly common resident of respiratory tracts. And for most people, as long as they have a decently functioning immune system, this will not be a problem for them. It is spread by droplets, so people who are carrying it can spread it to other people fairly easily. But for people who have a compromised immune system, especially people who have HIV, this particular fungus can be very problematic and cause a very nasty case of pneumonia. One of the reasons I do like to mention this one specifically is because this is one of the AIDS-defining illnesses. So remember when we talked about HIV and we talked about what it means to be HIV positive versus what it means to have AIDS. This is one of those infections that if a person is HIV positive and they develop this infection, they are considered to have progressed to the stage of having AIDS. In terms of treatment, it is a little bit trickier to treat this one because it lacks ergosterol. So remember we talked about fungal structures previously in antifungal medication, and we talked about how fungi have their sterol that's called ergosterol, and humans have cholesterol. And most of our antifungal medications, or at least a significant portion of them, work to destroy fungal sterols without interfering with human sterols. But this particular fungi actually doesn't have that sterol that most of our antifungals work on. So it does require special antifungals to be given to a patient who has this infection to make sure that they actually are able to clear it and hopefully move on with their life.